Which is the most haunting deathbed confession you know of? There was a couple where the wife got some mental illness where she wouldn't go outside the house. This went on for years. Eventually, after counseling, she made a little progress and agreed to go to the drugstore one night. She went in while her husband stayed in the car. While she was in the drugstore, someone walked in, shot her in the back of the head and walked out. She died immediately and the shooter was never caught. For years everyone thought it was some insane paranormal thing. Like she somehow knew that being out in public would lead to her death, etc. Many decades later, the husband admitted on his deathbed that he had hired someone to kill her because he could not take her mental illness anymore. My grandmother confessed to me that I'm adopted. What haunts me is that her dementia was so bad that she legitimately believed I didn't know. For context, I'm Korean, my sister's Mexican, and our parents are white. I spent the last few hours with her letting her act as if she were breaking it to me gently and promising I wouldn't be upset with my parents for not telling me, even though they had, and it was kinda hard to miss. My stepfather requested to see the two other families he had that nobody knew about on his deathbed. Boy, was that fun. When I was in hospital, the guy in the bed next to me just asked to stop taking his meds as he was ready to die. Last thing I heard him say was, "There's no one waiting for me at home, so I'm going where they are." Wasn't really a shocking confession, just a lonely and heartbreaking one. My great-great-uncle admitted on his deathbed that he wasn't actually related to our family. He'd spent the last 40 years in the US using one of our distant relatives' citizenship papers since they looked close enough, and in the 1920s that was really all you needed. He didn't kill the real uncle or anything, the guy had just decided America wasn't for him and went home. This dude was like, "Hey, since you aren't wanting to go back, can I have your papers?" And that was that. Not haunting at all, but my family doesn't have very many deathbed confessions, so it's still technically the most haunting. One of my uncles confessed to having 2 other children with another woman. He thought he was going to die from COVID, and I guess he felt he needed to come clean. He didn't die. That was back in 2020, and there's still a ridiculous amount of drama happening over potential inheritances and whatnot. My wife is a CNA in a nursing home. She had a resident who was formerly a delivery nurse in the 70s and 80s. When she was on her last few breaths, my wife was leaning into her face to clean it, and she whispered in my wife's ear, "When I was a nurse, I switched babies around." I'm not sure what's worse, knowing that one child may not be your child, or that this woman could have done it many times. This was as in Nicaragua. My grandmother let us all know that she was a product of rape. My great-grandmother was an indentured servant on a sugarcane plantation and was assaulted by its owner. A rich family that still owns a lot of land to this day. Our great-grandmother gained her freedom from the sugarcane plantation because of her pregnancy. And was even given hush money and a house. The house we were all standing in that night. My whole family now understood why our great-grandmother was the way she was. It all made sense. Made us all sad that she was never comforted. That bitch that said Emmett Till didn't do it right before she died. Reading these is crazy. All my grandpa said on his deathbed was, "Can someone turn off that smell?" after I opened my breakfast burrito. There was an ongoing land dispute in the family, and my grandpa just before dying told me that the whole land is mine on his will. 8 years later, I still haven't tackled or talked about it yet. My grandpa whispered something cryptic right before he passed. He said, "The garden gnome. It was always him," and then just closed his eyes forever. It's been 10 years, and I still get chills thinking about it. I mean, what garden gnome? Why him? I never even got to ask. My wife's grandmother called her husband over to her and said something along the lines of, "I've hated you for decades. You are a racist, controlling bastard." She died a few minutes later. He went down to the cafeteria and got lunch. Not really this, but my mom was raised in KY, where all the miners and coal operators were in conflict in the 1930s and on, and she told about some older man who had worked for the coal company and had presumably done some bad stuff on their behalf. Car bombs, shootings, I don't know. As he lay dying in the hospital years later, the coal co. had someone sit in his room 24 hours to be sure he did not do any deathbed confessions. Creepy as hell, I always thought. Father thought he murdered a woman when he was teenage little shit. I asked for name and he told me, and I looked it up on smartphone and found out and was dead, but she died in September 11th attack, not when my father beat the shit out of her in the 70s. It was a weird sense of relief that he didn't directly murder someone but also acknowledge he was a woman abuser who thought he legitimately killed. It was weird, but the priest gave him last rites, or I confirmed to him he didn't murder anybody.